Socialist Humanism and Science by Umberto Cerroni. Umberto Cerroni has studied the institutions of socialism in two books, Kant and the Foundation of the Juridical Category, and Marx and Modern Law. He teaches philosophy of law at the University of Rome, where he completed his studies in 1947, is a member of the Italian Society for the Philosophy of Law and of the Executive Committee of the Antonio Gramsci Institute in Rome. Directs the publication of Rassegna Sovietica, Soviet Review, and has contributed to numerous cultural publications. He was born in Milan in 1926. Section 1. Words have a history, and the term socialist humanism is no exception to this rule. It has two principal meanings, which will be discussed. The first derives from social democratic tradition and has been updated by some existentialist interpretations of Marx's notion. A whole sector of theoretical, quote, revisionism has proceeded to abandon revolutionary thought and action itself, preaching the, quote, humanistic characteristics of Marxism, for the sake of which they have sacrificed their, quote, narrow classist characteristics, and have finished integrating capital sometimes with the metaphysics of fashion, and sometimes with the phenomenology of spirit. The tendency is quite well represented by certain interpretations of Austrian Marxism, by Leon Blum's socialism, quote, on human scale, end quote, or by other more recent ideas, Lefebvre, Hippolyte, Calvez, Tucker, etc. A second meaning, current in the USSR during the Stalin era, has considered, quote, socialist humanism as the moral output of classical socialism. However, if the first tendency has striven to liquidate the Marxist science theoretically, the second has preached its moralistic principles precisely while executing in practice the most dehumanized distortions of socialism. There is, therefore, reason enough to be on guard vis-a-vis both versions of the term. Nevertheless, it would be unfair to distrust the term socialist humanism itself. Rather, we should distrust the ideas previously associated with socialist humanism and subject them to criticism. It seems to me that the defects of the term in question are derived from the traditional corruptions that the word humanism has suffered. Corruptions that consist substantially in rationalization, and moralizing rhetorics. It should be noted that deformations of this type originated because a precise reference to the contents and historical meaning of humanism had been lost. Among these meanings, two seem essential. The first, ripened during the theoretical polemics that marked the dissolution of the old medieval theological culture, consisted in the secularization of thought, that is, in the construction of rationalistic perspectives which obtained their intellectual baptism from the awakening experimental sciences. The second, developed above all in the modern utopian way of thinking, originated in the intuition of the integration of the individual, mankind, and nature, the perfectibility of the earthly, quote, earthly city, and therefore the transference of moral problems from the otherworldly sphere, or interiority, to the worldly sphere, or exteriority. Man's problem was reduced from that of, quote, salvation, or purity of intentions, to that of liberation. and, in the final analysis, a social emancipation. Outside this context and historical meaning, the term humanism seems to lack any important cultural values. It can therefore be said that the discussion of humanism is a discussion of the theoretical and practical consequences, gnosiologically, I guess that's how I say it, Gnosio logically, gnosiologically and socially of lay culture. Attempts have been made, for instance, those of Jacques Maritain, to extract a sort of humanism from the transcending vision of Christianity. But these attempts are, I believe, plagued with errors. This is a discussion, therefore, of the consistency, vigor, and historical adequacy of a rational program scientifically founded on the knowledge of the human world, and therefore of the unification of knowledge, and of a social program constituting the integration of the individual with society. If this is true, the importance of the struggles of Marxist theoreticians to construct a socialist humanism will easily be understood at the moment when modern thought seems to have abandoned the two principles we have just outlined. Starting from a well-founded criticism of the dogmatism and moralistic tradition, starting from a well-founded criticism of the dogmatic and moralist tradition, this struggle has progressively deepened the division between, quote, humanistic sciences and natural and physical sciences. The separation of the, quote, human kingdom from the, quote, kingdom of nature implies the necessity of a Kantian, quote, teleological integration of scientific knowledge and must culminate in a Hegelian reduction of history to philosophy as a mere phenomenology of the spirit, or it implies the necessity to conceive the structure of human knowledge as a non-causal structure, quote, or a non-causal structure, non-explanatory, or as comprehensive. Instead, the era of the most important progress of science is also the era of the renaissance of the most serious metaphysical tendencies in social sciences. Even the young sociological science has again requested the help of philosophy and even of rationalism. It will be enough to recall the critical considerations of C. Wright Mills. On the other hand, ideal types have been considered as typical, quote, points of reference. It might suffice, for instance, to think of the manner in which Kelsen deals with the problem of democracy. It would be interesting, but too laborious, to analyze the historical components of these two sequences. We can see these two sequences, for example, in the fundamentally skeptical results which the critical examination of abstract rationalism, Kant, has come to, and in the progressing limitations of the problems inherited from the analysis of classical economy. In short, it seems that modern theoretical conscience has again brought to light the incapacity of the intellect to know simultaneously the world and the, quote, irregularity, individuality, irrepeatability in economic, social, and political phenomenon, and therefore the impossibility of transforming them. Even more interesting and urgent seems, therefore, the program of a socialist humanism. But this program will be fruitful only when this program can be rid simultaneously of the two typical, quote, rhetoric defects of humanism, i.e., abstraction and moralism. In short, if socialist humanism is to be freed from the dangers of agnosticism and irrationalism, which we are denouncing in modern thought, it should also be liberated from the abstractionism of the old dogmatic rationalism and from the merely utopian characteristics of social projections. The one, in fact, reduces thought to the empirical prison of things, while the other confirms man in his present social conditions. Only thus is it possible, I think, to reconquer, through the cognizance of the world, the scientific functions of the intellect, and along with the notion of the transformability of society, its causal structure. In both fields, the gnosiological and the ethical social, the most difficult and fruitful work theoretical Marxism can undertake is to recover either the hypothetical experimental structure of thought or the causal objective foundation of the world and of society. A socialist humanism freed from all rhetorics, and therefore of all abstract assertions, not confirmed by science or by real transformation, needs, above all, to be constructed as a science. It is in this that its materialistic character must consist. The scientific seriousness of this problem, Section 2. The scientific seriousness of this problem and the momentousness of the tasks assumed by a social movement such as Marxism prevent us from forgetting criticism made not so much against Marx, but against Marxists working in our time. This criticism tends to demonstrate the incoherence of a humanistic program understood in the terms we have briefly recalled. This criticism has in essence sustained two theses. A, that on a theoretical basis, Marxism has developed a metaphysics, and therefore the dogmatism of a new laical theology, which has become secondary to science. And B, that in the practical sphere, socialism is to date very far from constructing an institutional system, economic, political, capable of injecting in science the need of a profound and direct social integration. These are severe criticisms, and it would be useless to pretend that they cannot be sustained by authentic evidence. Stalin's years are there to prove them. In fact, in those years, in the name of Marxism, something very serious that must worry us has happened. In the theoretical sphere, a vilification of science and its methods of investigation, founded on the free intellectual construction of hypotheses and their strict causal verification, and in the practical sphere, an almost inconceivable, at least for a Marxist, distortion of the scientific experimental foundations of the economic social construction. We cannot avoid the problem by counting the years that separate us from Stalin. We need rather to measure the critical distance separating the socialism of that era from the destruction effected today by all the distortions of Marxism. I do not pretend to reopen here the discussion of such a complex phenomenon. I think, however, that we must, for our purposes, recognize the criticisms we have mentioned and examine them in order to arrive at a project for a socialist humanism that is not mere rhetoric. At this point, however, our talk must necessarily turn toward Marx, this thinker who is already the great phenomenon of world culture, this Aristotle of modern times. My thesis is that among Marxists themselves, there has existed for a long time a great misunderstanding regarding Marx. If synthesizing is permitted, this misunderstanding can be abridged as follows. Too many Marxists still consider that the main task of the Marxist thought is to guide an, quote, exact and, quote, scientific philosophy before which the very natural and physical sciences would be considered simply as evidence or proof. And that exact philosophy, which would preserve a dimension qualitatively differing from the experimental science, dialectics would be the instrument. Not a few Marxist intellectuals, at least in Italy, have on the contrary articulated a different hypothesis. Marx has not elaborated a new philosophy unifying the world of knowledge and absorbing science, but has rather added to the knowledge of humanity the instruments of science. In short, Marx's dialectics do not regress science to philosophic reason, but introduce philosophic reason into scientific intellection. It is, of course, not possible to discuss both theses analytically, but we can consider some thoughts which arise from our thesis regarding the development of the socialist movement, and particularly the problem of socialist humanism. Section 3. The humanistic tenets of Marxist thought can no longer be seriously doubted after the posthumous publication of essays such as Criticism of the Hegelian Philosophy on Public Right, Economic Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844, and German Ideology. Even those rejecting historical materialism subscribe to such tenets, and what is more, they have constantly used them in opposition to the classic economic and political results of Marx's investigations. In fact, it seems that the hazards in the publication of Marx's work, not to mention those of its diffusion and popularization, have created a peculiar situation. The political socialist movement, which was based on the concept of the class struggles, has remained largely ignorant for a long time of the problems of the, quote, young Marx, while others, criticizing classical socialism, have often referred to the, quote, humanism of his youthful works. We thus witness a tacit repudiation of his youthful humanistic principles by precisely those forces which in practice have developed Marx's principles and should benefit from them. An attentive examination of the intellectual biography of Marx constantly reiterates one problem. The group of his works commonly called youthful constitutes the methodological transfer through which Marxist thought descends from philosophy to political economy, from the theoretical criticism to practical criticism, and even from a design of criticism to one of struggle. If the, quote, youthful thought is the road toward capital, it should always be considered either to explain the methodologic necessity of the reduction of philosophic criticism to economic social criticism, or to enlighten the methodological connections of this same investigation. Any other way of considering this early work is to risk impoverishing and denaturalizing the true thought of Marx, to graft it onto a traditional methodology, and to dissociate the economic scientific criticism from the general theoretical problems. Section 4. We do not want, however, to pose a problem of sheer philology. It seems to me, on the contrary, that these notes, which should be developed later, will serve to focus on a strictly practical problem regarding the history of the socialist movement. First of all, despite the assumptions of certain self-appointed executors of the will of Marxism, the ensemble of doctrines we call scientific socialism has been deprived of a scientific bond, a coherence and theoretical internal completeness, and the lack of these qualities has been substituted by the intrusion of theoretical elements, absolutely alien and even opposed to the true intellectual development of Marx. I refer to that, quote, dialectical materialism, from Engels to Stalin has done nothing but ask help or credit from the lower... I need to repeat a lot. First of all, despite the assumptions of certain self-appointed executors of the will of Marxism, the ensemble of doctrines we call scientific socialism has been deprived of a scientific bond, of coherence and theoretical internal completeness, and the lack of these qualities has been substituted by the intrusion of theoretical elements absolutely alien and even opposed to the true intellectual development of Marx. I refer to that, quote, dialectical materialism, which from Engels to Stalin has done nothing but ask for help or credit from that lower form of Hegelianism which was discarded by serious thinkers after the adventures of social Darwinism and of the 19th century positivism. Marx has been clearly, quote, integrated and therefore revised, following Hegel in a servile fashion, with consequences not less serious than those of neo-Kantian revisionism. During Stalin's regime, experimental science was forced to move along idealistic perspectives based on those, quote, pre-notions against which Bacon, the founder of the experimental method, had already fought. Philosophy was in this guise liberated again from science and revolved once more around its axis, shrinking the social and political sciences into a dogmatic and utopian theory and finding in dialectics, Hegelian, a passkey to open all doors and therefore nothing. Once philosophy was restituted to its perennial sphere, it was logical that so much talked about humanism would afterward return to an anthropology fatally inclined to the old moralistic generalities. Socialist humanism, therefore, ended in the pure and simple rhetorical exaltation of its ends, and afterward in the, quote, surrendering of the individual to the community. Let us add that this community, necessarily opposed to the interaction of individuals, could not consist in anything but the present state. Hence, this surrendering resolved itself in a moralist reinforcement of the domination-subordination relationship of constituted authority over the worker. In this manner, all the humanistic potentiality of socialism turned into statism. In the Hegelian manner, the socialist state became, quote, a substantial unity with a self-purpose, absolute, motionless, wherein liberty reaches its supreme right and whose final objective has a priority right against that of individuals whose utmost duty consists in being components of the state. End quote. Hegel. It may well be that, even without knowing it, socialism was returning to the old path of statist moralism, searching for the mediation between the individual and the community, no longer in the naturalistic dimensions of the socialization of the means of production and consequently of social government, but precisely in that, quote, metaphysic power of the state, end quote, against which the young Marx had fought with Hegel. The socialization of man becomes then rather a pedagogic, moralistic problem of the state, and not a real and practical procedure. And the activities of the state, instead of being specific functions of the association of producers, were on the contrary projected as ends in themselves, as, quote, formalities, or as, quote, rights, R-I-T-E-S. From these ceremonial rights, all the traditional components were resurrected: bureaucracy, formalism, pedagogism, official truth, secrecy, mysticism of hierarchies and of the head of the state, and the subordination of real science to the formal, quote, science of politics. Above all, the separation of society and state, of individual and community, was revived, a separation that socialism should have all but abolished, and that by its continued existence resulted in persecution and ulterior theoretical sanction. It is true that it was a, quote, new state, the state of workers. Despite this, whoever theorized on this novelty evidently lost sight of the fact that neither the change in political personnel nor the change of the state's objectives can achieve by itself a change in the positive structure of the state as a, quote, merely delusory community. Excuse me. Despite, it is true that it was a new state, the state of workers. Despite this, whoever theorized on this novelty evidently lost sight of the fact that neither the change in political personnel nor the change of the state's objectives can achieve by itself a change in the positive structure of the state as a, quote, merely delusory community, end quote, Marx. In short, the unifying function of the socialist state can be developed only through the specific manner of its subordination to society, of the progressive transference of its functions to the community of workers, and of the progressive transformation into communist self-government. Section 5. Certain conclusions can be drawn from what we have said. Socialist humanism must, in the first place, rid itself of that secular tradition of dogmatic rationalism which pretends to be above science, and arrive at conducting social investigation with the typical methods of science. That is to say, it must base knowledge on the examination of actual social relationships. Only in this way can the primacy of political economy make sense within the sphere of social disciplines. In the second place, socialist humanism must construct its own models of social transformation as functions of scientific criticism of the capitalist social structure, avoiding in this way the pure mental, dogmatic search of socialistic construction. In the third place, it must accept the merely experimental nature of its models, Thus, these models can be modified in accordance with their efficiency in the transformation of relationships inherited from the past. In the fourth place, it must realize, in the special level of political theory, that the authentic efficiency of its models should be measured taking into consideration not only a future of complete social homogenization, communism, but also the possibility of attaining the consent of workers and stimulating their organization. In the present, it is only in this sense that communism can succeed as a supreme achievement, even arriving at the dissolution of democracy. Recapitulating briefly, we could adopt the formula: an authentic humanism, which can only be socialistic and therefore materialistic, a socializer and an emancipator of workers, must succeed in grounding all knowledge on science, in order to free itself from the rationality of its, quote, autosufficiency and its abstractionism. A science of society, while it cuts the abstract rationalistic tradition from philosophy, and also liberates science, confined to nature, from its scientist anguish, organically grafts it onto society, and connects at the same time the social development, an area reserved to philosophical speculation, with science. In short, it completely establishes that relationship of reason, consent, interest, which has to date been separated into two kingdoms: that of the rationalistic, idealistic area of philosophy versus science, or freedom versus necessity. Along this line, we do not find it difficult to envision even the practical construction of a society where, through the Marxist program of a thorough naturalization of man and a thorough socialization of nature, the harmonization of individual and society would be absolutely feasible. In reality, the individual would succeed in realizing himself, all the more since his liberty would necessarily imply a conscious and interested participation in society. On the other hand, the human society would benefit more when its members became thoroughly integrated on the basis of a hierarchy of effective assets of each member. Neither reason above science, nor science above reason, neither the individual over society, nor the society over the individual. Once the critical requirements we have outlined are satisfied, the program for a socialist, anti-rhetorical, and historically efficient humanism seemed to be established. Translated by T. Gill.